I aspire to this being service design TV.
Love that. Okay, so we're good for a few. Oh, actually, if you hold that pose there, Tobin, you actually mirror your photo. Yeah, it's great. It's like,
I know, I should have worn the same outfit. My goodness.
I aspire to this being service design. Oops, sorry. Okay. Oops. Okay, so we're now live on YouTube. We're going to record on go to the clouds, continue. Let's have a bit of
background. Oh yeah. Okay. See you guys in a few minutes.
It's on YouTube. Okay, Judah, over to you.
Thank you. And welcome everybody that's joining us from wherever you're joining us. And I see that we have some international joining us opportunities here. And welcome to Tobin. So I'm really excited that Tobin's going to be speaking, because normally in our practitioners talks we will have service designers from different fields coming in and giving us war stories of service design. I can't actually believe I said that word. Totally inappropriate, but stories of service design across the world and interesting narratives around that. Why I'm really excited about Tobin coming in to speak to us is because actually Tobin, although would not call herself a service designer or even studied service design, but actually demonstrates incredible attributes and skills that a service designer will have. And actually there's loads that we can learn from her practice, loads that we can learn from her approach. That I think could be super relevant. Now, I'm not sure if you're doing a presentation thing. We're not doing a talky thing, are we?
Yeah, I thought I would show a bunch of visuals.
It's my favorite. Okay, so let me just make sure that you can actually share those. That's stuff. Oh, can you share the screen, by the way?
Let's see. Yes.
Awesome. Okay, brilliant. In that case, do you need anything else from us at all?
No, we can jump in.
We can jump in. Okay, and then we got a little slot for some questions later, right?
Yeah. I'm going to try and keep this quite tight so that we can get into a conversation.
Okay, well, just take the allocated 3 hours that you said you needed, so that's fine.
Yeah, we have 5 hours, right? We're good. Okay. So I'm going to share here. You can see this. Judah, it's now black screen. Is that true?
Yeah, it's a black screen.
Great, thank you. So thank you so much for the invite. This is really exciting, and I'm so happy to get into conversation with you all today. I think I might have met some of you about a month ago during the Social Impact Challenge Lab launch or lunch event. You were all presenting some of your work that you've been doing with Judah, and so I was able to sit in actually on a couple of those breakout sessions, and it was really wonderful, and your work is really fascinating. So I'm excited to share a little bit about my practice in the context of all of that, and excited to chat with you all today about that more. So I don't have a title for this talk, so I'm calling it what it is, a practitioner's talk, and share a little bit about my practice as a designer and how it's evolving. So to start, I want to give just a little bit of a brief intro into myself. Judah kind of already mentioned it, but I don't have a background in service design. And I promise I'm not going to give my whole life story here. But I am from a city called Edmonton in Western Northern Canada, which is a beautiful city. It's cold, it's snowy. But I currently live in a different beautiful city now, Barcelona, which is also beautiful, but warm and sunnier. And I started off actually as an interior designer, working in that space for a while, and then eventually continued to practice that and went to Rhode Island School of Design for my master's in interior architecture. And I got really interested in working more in sort of like a strategic systems design practice space, or applying design skill sets into other spaces where we don't really find designers that often. So I started exploring what that might look like in government. And then I've been able to continue that practice in my current role right now as a strategic designer at the Center for Complexity at Rhode Island School of Design, which I know is a mouthful. So we're going to call it CFC for short. And if you don't know about the CFC, I'm just going to give a little bit of background as to what we do. So it's a mashup of a bunch of different things, but it's a functioning design studio that takes on projects, multi-year projects with many, many different collaborators and partners. We're also a research platform, and that takes the form of many different things. So it can be done through convenings like this. They often look a little bit more like this in times of COVID. The other way that we do that is lectures and bringing on fellows. And if you look closely, there's Judah. And actually, this is how I met Judah. He was one of our fellows early on. This is right before the pandemic started, actually, which is why everyone looks pre-COVIDly and close and non-masked. We also do this through disseminating knowledge through other forms, whether it's through publication, oftentimes sharing the ideas and knowledge of smarter people than us. And we also, we're sort of a third space for transdisciplinary collaboration for students and faculty across the institution to sort of step outside of their departments and work on research or projects with us that sort of extend beyond the walls of the institution. So our goal at the CFC is to explore and apply creative practices to complex and systemic challenges in society. And currently we are organizing our work in these three different areas. So we have a bunch of work in global security, a really long-term project around nuclear threat reduction. We also have a lot of different efforts and initiative around systems of care, which is looking at the opioid care and addiction realm, as well as health equity, and design and public policy, engaging in government and NGOs and those sorts of things. And this is our team. So we're a small team, but what's really fascinating is, although we're small, we bring quite a diverse perspective and disciplines and skill sets to the work. So even just amongst this core group of people, we have somebody with a background in sociology, we have an ex-politician, we have a couple architects, a journalist, a technologist, educators. So even within our small sort of core team, it's quite wonderful working with non-designers, and of course in our collaborations and partnerships beyond that as well. So that's a little bit about the Center for Complexity and where I work. When Judah invited me to give this practitioner's talk, I was trying to think about what I wanted to talk about and what might be interested to, have a conversation about with service design students. And I was reflecting on that word practice as an entry point into thinking about that. I started to ask myself, what is the role of designer? And I know that's probably quite a context specific question. And the answer is probably, it depends. But I still think it's kind of actually an important question, and maybe perhaps a little bit uninterrogated. And maybe this is a little bit because I've actually had a hard time talking to my family and friends and explaining them what I do. What is the role of myself as a designer? What do I do for a living? And I think oftentimes, because we have these disciplinary titles, they sort of define that for us. You're a service designer, you create services. You're an architect, you create architecture. But I think it's actually much more nuanced than that. And I think it's changing actually quite a bit. I think more designers are wanting to engage in things that matter to us, that are important things that are going on in the world, whether it's social challenges or environmental challenges. And these are really complex issues to be working on, and they require new ways of meeting the nature of these challenges. So this question becomes really interesting, and something I wanted to sort of open up with you all today and talk about. So I hope it is interesting to you all as well. And the way that I want to talk about this, or sort of surface and answer that question, at least for myself, is I'm going to use one area of work that I've been engaged in over the past few years as a way to surface those reflections. And that is the ongoing opioid crisis in the US. That's how you might have heard of it. That's how the media commonly refers to it. But I mean, more accurately, it's what we have is actually an overdose and substance use crisis in the US. And if you don't know much about it, I just wanted to provide a little bit of context as to what this overdose crisis is. So in a nutshell, it's about sort of the extreme increase of people overdosing and dying from drug-related, using drugs and substances. And the history of this actually goes back, more than 100 years in the US. But this current wave that we're seeing right now sort of has roots starting about 20 years ago in the 1990s, when pharmaceutical companies were coming up with new pain medications like opioids, certain kinds like OxyContin, which you might be familiar with. And they were aggressively marketing them to doctors, which led a lot of doctors to overprescribe these really, really addictive pain medications, which led a lot of people to become addicted. And so if people couldn't get enough legal supply from doctors, it sort of drove a lot of people to an illicit market, which created this huge, huge demand for street drugs. And the reason it's sort of an overdose substance use crisis now is because in the US, there's a really toxic drug supply. In the streets, drugs are being cut with other cheaper substances like fentanyl, which are much more lethal and potent. And so what ends up happening is people are taking these substances, not knowing what's in them, and overdosing and dying. And what's scary is that this isn't only happening to people who use drugs frequently, but this is happening, for people who are experimenting with drugs for the very first time, college students in university at a party, for example. And as you can imagine, as COVID has exacerbated many, many things, drug overdose death rates have gone way up in the US because of isolation, because people are getting cut off from care treatment. And so over the 1 year period of, between 2020 and 2021, we saw the highest rates of death in the US in a 1 year period, which was over 100,000 people. And to date, there's been over 1 million people who have lost their lives to overdose over the past 20 years since this has started. And it's hard to sort of grasp and fathom the weight and the levity of this. It's hard to sort of even imagine and think about that many lives, just the sheer number of lives that we've lost that we didn't need to lose. So it's a weighty topic, and there's a lot in there. And I just want to mention just one more thing on this, that in addition to some of those causes that I mentioned, there are many, many underlying factors and dynamics that at play that are shaping the system that we currently have and how this sort of crisis is evolving. And I just want to name 3 sort of big ones. So one is around the narrative. In the US, we've created this narrative over time that if you use drugs or you become addicted, it's considered a moral failing. That's the narrative that we're telling the people have been told, that, you're using drugs, you brought this upon yourself, you should be shamed and sort of stigmatized out of society, which is interesting because that hasn't always been the case in the US. This started really in the 20th century. The US had a very different relationship to drugs and substances before then. But what this has led to is it's helped bolster and create a system around that mental model, around these narratives, that drug use is bad and therefore should be criminalized. It's a criminal matter, which further pushes people out of society. And in a lot of countries, they've taken a different approach, or have started to take a different approach, which is treated as a public health challenge, not a criminal matter. And unfortunately, that has led to an explosion of incarceration, which has disproportionately imprisoned many people of color. So we have a system that has been designed around these mental models and these narratives and these policies that are based on, somewhat, flawed understandings and errors in the way that we have thought about these things. These are human-made decisions, but these decisions, they can be made differently. And I think we're starting to see in the US that already we're starting to see changes in the narratives and how people want to approach this challenge, because we've got it wrong. And the reason we're interested in this topic in the first place is it's really sort of hit home for us in Rhode Island. Rhode Island has been extremely impacted by this, and its death rates are extremely up. And so it's affecting our communities. It's happening in our own backyard. So how did we even start engaging in this challenge? For us, we started with a lot of hesitancy of even engaging in this area, because there have been so many people working in this space for so long doing amazing things. And we didn't want to assume that design had any value or, anything to really offer in this space. We weren't sure. And so we, as a starting point, just to figure out what was going on in the space to learn, we started showing up to as many different places, many different things as possible, as learners, as listeners, and as observers. So what did that look like? We started showing up to the government task force meetings, which is a body of people who are working in different parts of the system, from healthcare to law enforcement to community organizations. And they're tasked with figuring out strategies or solutions to tackling the crisis. And so they meet once a month, and it's a place for people to exchange information with one another, the newest research, the newest data, data on hospital rates and things like that. We also started attending a harm reduction reading group that was hosted by Brown University, and this was open to the public. And actually, Judah came to a couple of these with us, where again, it was a group of people that would talk about the latest research or best practices in recovery. So another space for people to exchange knowledge with one another. We were participating in community organized events like a hackathon. We started visiting, doing site visits and visiting other organizations. So this one on the left is a harm reduction service organization. The one on the right is a methadone clinic. And for us, the purpose was to learn about what are the existing programs or services that are being offered. We joined social workers and caseworkers who were doing morning street outreach. And these are folks who work with the homeless population, connecting them to services or providing support. And so that can look like anything from helping them get their IDs or driving them to court trials or getting them doctor's appointments. And we started showing our support for the community. This was a vigil that was held at the end of 2020 in Rhode Island to commemorate the 400 lives that were lost in that year. So we did that for about 6 months, maybe actually even a little bit longer. And fortunately, we had the time, we had the luxury of time of doing that. And I know that that's not always the case, but we did take that time to really understand what was going on. What is the current system like? How is it, and why is it like that? And I think because we didn't enter with sort of that designer mindset, it sort of allowed us to not go in as, identifying problems or opportunities right away, and places where we could intervene, but it allowed us to really just sort of see the system as it was. It also allowed us to meet people and build relationships, which over time led to being able to build a level of trust and credibility. Partially because we continued to show up time and time again. And I think this was an interesting one, is sort of how do you build trust? And I think, unfortunately, designers are definitely guilty of this. Sciences and science research is definitely guilty of this. Oftentimes we go into these spaces and environments for our research or to get information about our project, and we leave and never come back to these communities, or the communities never see our work again. And that leads to a very extractive relationship, which leads to a lot of mistrust and harm. And so we were conscious of, not repeating or perpetuating those harms. The other thing that we observed was there's a lot of people working in this space, from medical professionals to politicians, community organizations, drug users, scientists, law enforcement, but there actually, there isn't a lot of designers or creatives or artists engaging in this. And so we thought that, perhaps we're starting to sort of learn or see where design could add a value, or where designers could play a role and add value. But what kind of role? What kind, where could we provide value? And so we weren't totally sure what that would look like. So the first exploration for us, and probably the most common role that we find ourselves in as designers, is designer as maker. Designer as creator or problem solver or intervener, intervening and implementing our ideas and solutions. So we developed a project called Mainstay, and this is a self-initiated project. And if you remember that hackathon I mentioned earlier, this project actually was created during that event. And so when our team showed up at the event, we decided to split up and team up with other community members who were at the event. And our team ended up winning first place, which gave us some seed funding, small seed funding, to continue developing the project beyond the event. And so we decided to do so. Some of our team changed a little bit. We dropped a couple members, a couple new members joined. And our team are these folks. So we have a community organizer, a health researcher, a nurse, a journalist, and a designer. So it's quite a mixed team. So what was the idea? So Mainstay, the idea of Mainstay was to create a space for people to go after they've woken up from a drug overdose, to receive dedicated support in a trauma-informed environment, which is an alternative to what currently exists. Currently, people who wake up from an overdose oftentimes are in public, in their cars, in a park, or in the emergency department. And EDs are not designed to handle these kinds of cases or to provide this kind of specific support. And so instead of redesigning the EDs, we were thinking of alternative spaces that were specifically for these folks. So we have this big ambitious idea, this big ambitious proposal, and it was a good idea that got past a 2-minute pitch at a weekend design sprint. But how do we move the idea forward? How do we go from sort of 0 to 100? What is this place? Where is it? How do people get there? Who works there? And we, as a team, quickly realized that we were not the right people, nor were we in the right position to be able to operate or open up a space like this and really pull off this idea. So we pivoted. And now we've decided to use this idea, this proposal, really as sort of a Trojan horse strategy for us, as a vehicle to continue to probe the challenge. So designer as prober, actually. And so we're using it as a way to continue to ask questions and learn more about the challenge. It's also become a bit of an excuse for us to connect with people and meet and have conversations, because now we are sort of bringing people together around this really concrete idea, to talk about something like a shared idea together. And so creating visuals can be really helpful in that. These tools, to help people engage in conversation. So now we can talk about, are these spaces, are they embedded in hospitals? Are they outside of a hospital? Are they mobile and they move around the city? Should they be all of the above? And now we can start really having concrete conversations about what the reality of this might look like. And so for us, these visuals aren't about depicting the solution, but they're propositions and sort of tools in service of asking better questions. The other interesting thing that we're doing with this project as a way to sort of probe the boundaries and limitations or opportunities of our disciplinary structures is, because our team exists between the world of science and design, we have kind of gone really deep inside the belly of science world. And so in the world of science, research is a very structured system, and it has a built-in level of oversight. And so they have something what's called in the US an institutional review board. I think in the UK you have something similar. I think it's called a research ethics committee, and it's sort of the equivalent. And it's, a group of people that are formally designated to approve or disapprove scientific research proposals that involve human subjects. And it serves an important role because it's protecting, right? It's sort of there to protect the rights of humans in research. So we decided to go down this path, and we're interested in using our project to learn about how research is constructed, how new knowledge and evidence is created, and how can we do interdisciplinary collaborations and improve our processes or practices together, scientists working with designers. And so we explored, many different ways that we might merge design methods into a scientific framework. So, for example, creating models or objects or artifacts to engage with people during interviews rather than just having a verbal interview conversation with people. Just as a side note, in order for me to actually do any of this research with my science colleagues, I actually needed to get certified to do the research. And so that required me to really go deep into the world of science and do exams and modules and learn about the history of research in science and how to do this work ethically. So that's exciting. I'm able to now do more science research projects in the future. And right now we're sorting through the evidence from our interviews through this very sciencey looking software program. And the learnings from these conversations are really informing us about some really fundamental things. We have, in the interviews, we ask people quite open-ended questions because we didn't want to assume and we didn't want to sort of create very narrow or predefined understandings. And so we asked people how they understood or how they defined treatment for themselves. And surprisingly or unsurprisingly, people define treatment way beyond the medical notion, which is sort of the dominant way that we think about treatment in the US. And people's response was actually, having a purpose in life, being in a supporting, loving relationship, cooking, gardening, being in nature, having a dog. Those are the things that really actually help me in treatment or in recovery. And so this role, designer as probe, is allowing us to, I think, do a couple different things. It's allowing us to understand how our systems of care have been shaped and designed and how that meets or doesn't meet the real needs and experiences of many people. It's also allowing us to continue to meet people and build relationships and connect with people. And I think we're experiencing sort of firsthand some of the limitations of some of the structures that are in place for how we construct knowledge, how we collaborate. And so we're sort of experimenting within our own team. How do we do collaborations between different professions and silos? How do we create sort of shared language and shared methodologies and merge our skill sets together? So that's one role. The second role it sort of actually came out of this learning. So one of the things that we learned over time was that there's a lot of opportunities in Rhode Island for people to share knowledge with one another, share latest research, the newest data. So I mentioned earlier, things like government meetings, a lot of community meetings, and being able to share what's going on, live in the moment. So we have a lot of spaces for knowledge transfer, but there isn't a lot of opportunities for people to come together and collaborate to create new knowledge. And I think it's, oftentimes because we exist within these silos, we don't have a lot of many, great mechanisms in place for people to work across those silos or to work across disciplines or professions or these, departments, which is extremely important because this challenge is so interconnected and requires a shared effort. And so this became the question for us. What kinds of spaces do we need to create for ourselves to be able to collaborate, to be able to have diverse perspectives working together? And I mean, one of the things we heard over and over again from many people who use drugs is, oftentimes they're invited into these meetings and into these spaces to share their stories or share their life experience. And it doesn't really go much further than that. They're not, the invite doesn't extend beyond that in having them be co-creators or co-decision makers as well. And so, how can we create and enable spaces that enable that? So the second role we learned that we could possibly add value was designer as host, or as connector, facilitator, condition setter. So in this role, we did an experiment. So last summer, we ran with our science research partners, we ran 2 design studios, and it would have been lovely to have run these in person, but of course, because of COVID, we did it virtually. And design studios, I mean, both of us right now are sitting within an art and design school, both at the RCA and at RISD. And so we know what design studios are. They're, for us, we use them as a space for creating new knowledge, a space for collaboration, a space for exploration. And so we wanted to test this idea. Are design studios a productive mechanism to do this? So we invited 14 brave people to carve out time in their busy schedules and come together and work together. And the goal that we had set for ourselves was to come up with ideas and strategies and priorities for how things need to shift in Rhode Island. And we spent a lot of time curating who would be in the studios, because again, we wanted to bring different perspectives and life experiences. So in the studios, we had, everyone from medical professionals like pharmacists, doctors and nurses, to peer recovery coaches, community outreach workers, ex-law enforcement, community harm reduction organizations, etc. And why that's important, I think for us, the question was, how do we create the conditions for change? And that meant bringing together people who are in change-making positions, right? So these are the people who are able to write new policies or write new legislation. These are folks who are able to make decisions about how we treat patients differently, or some of these are the organizations that are actually going to open up safe injection facilities in Rhode Island. These are the people that are going to make those changes and are in positions to do so. So this led to 5 teams coming up with 5 different proposals, everything ranging from sort of very tactical ideas around expanding the distribution of a certain medication to thinking about the design and staffing of what they call harm reduction centers. So just for some interesting background context, 2 weeks before we ran the studios, Rhode Island became the first state in the US to legalize harm reduction centers, or safe injection sites, safe injection facilities, overdose prevention sites. There's many, many different names for them. But right now in the US, or for a long time in the US, they were illegal. You couldn't open these spaces up, but in other places in the world you can. And so Rhode Island became the first state to do so. And we had, the team who was working on, giving this idea definition now that it could actually become a reality in Rhode Island. And so we had the actual senator who wrote the bill working on this alongside somebody who has experience in recovery, working with communities, alongside a nurse. All the way up until, some more conceptual ideas. So this was a group that created a manifesto for what a true system of care in Rhode Island would look like. And we turned this into a nicely designed report partially because white papers are the currency for a lot of people in this space, for medicine, for science, for politicians. White papers are, a legitimate way of sharing knowledge. And so we wanted to create a tool for them to use to be able to have, using conversations that they would continue to have post studio. We also actually captured the process in this report because there might be the potential here for others to take on or implement similar kinds of activity. But the report, it's valuable for those reasons. But I think the thing that we're noticing now is, the worst thing that could happen, or a lot of times what happens is that these become shelved reports, and that would be sort of worst case scenario. And so I think the thing that we're exploring right now is how do we create better ways or better mechanisms for the transfer of knowledge and ideas. And so we're exploring that right now. And actually one of the ways we're doing it is this report we're going to use this report and the questions in it to kick off a series of research projects that public health researchers are going to take on that are going to hopefully use some of these questions that are more sort of framed strategically. But I think that's an area, that's a really interesting area for us to explore right now, is how do we continue to transfer knowledge and ideas? How do we sort of connect those missing links? Because that there's a huge gap in being able to do that. I think the last thing about this that I'm sort of learning or thinking about for myself is, in addition to all the visible stuff and the ideas, we now have a cohort of people who have gone through this shared experience, collaborating and forming maybe new kinds of relationships or deeper connections with one another. And so, in addition to creating space for people to collaborate, I'm also thinking about how do we continue to cultivate or steward these networks of change, these relationships as well, not just the ideas, but the actual relationships. Because those networks, if they're tight, those are the things that are also going to move things. And hopefully we can, grow and expand this over time. The last learning and role that I'll touch on is this. So this is a bit of a different starting point. Rhode Island has a really, really strong and active community doing amazing things. There's a really strong local culture around wanting to see change, and they have a lot of power. They're starting to really move things and move policy because they're, it's a very strong and active community. So we have this asset, right? We have something that is strong and that's working. And so the question is, how do we amplify and support that? I think this role is interesting because I think in design, there's often this obsession with newness and innovation and always coming up with fresh ideas and new interventions and new solutions. And I come from a background in adaptive reuse, where we ask questions like, how do we adapt and reuse existing things? And so similarly here, how can we use our skills to support what's strong and what's working? And so the role of design for this is actually designer, not as, but designer in service of others, designer in service of supporting other people's work and uplifting it and amplifying it. And I just want to share a few examples of what that looks like for us. So this was an exhibit put on by a local community and a harm reduction organization. And it's a mock safe injection site. So these are sites where people can bring their drugs and use their substances safely. They can test their drugs and make sure they know what they're taking, do it with clean equipment, and have medical care professionals on standby if they need to be revived or need any kind of support. So this was last year, and before this legislation became legal, these spaces were illegal to open in the US. And so this group put on this mock exhibition to invite the public in as a way to create, an immersive experience for people to go through a space like this and understand what is its purpose, what's the goal here, what are these spaces like. So it was an educational tool, and they were the right organization to put on this exhibition. And we thought it was a great idea, and we wanted to help. So one of our teammates, who's a nurse, she was helping advise on the kinds of medical equipment that would be required in these spaces. We also helped give people tours of the space as well. And we also thought it would be a good idea to create some sort of feedback loop and use this as an opportunity to build some sort of evidence and data around what the public thought of these spaces, because soon they were going to, be in our neighborhoods and our communities. And so we created these pre and post surveys of the exhibition to learn about what the public thought about it pre and post. And so we're starting to build a little, body of evidence there, and hopefully that's helpful for informing the many people that are trying to open these spaces in different neighborhoods. Another way that we're continuing to support is we're showing up at meetings still. We're going to Harm Reduction Coalition meetings and providing any support there. And some of that work is as unglamorous and unsexy as just taking notes. Just being really good note takers actually goes a long way. And that's been really helpful. And the last example I'll show about this is there's an organization that actually will be probably the first one to open up a harm reduction center in Rhode Island. And they're trying to think about the ways in which, not necessarily to avoid NIMBYism, but we know there's going to be blowback. We know people not everyone's in support of this. And so they're trying to think about how to do that, how to navigate that. And so they are thinking about putting on an open house for the neighboring community to come in and talk with them and hear about what they want to do and have an open conversation. And so we are, the support we're providing here is as simple as, creating invitations that will go out to the neighborhood to invite them to this open house, and eventually, help pan them out. So I know I went through that super quickly, but I just wanted to share a little bit of the work that we're doing, because I think it's been interesting to think about this question of what is the role of designer and what is the role of design in these spaces. And especially for us, because we've been in this for 3 years now, the timepiece is really interesting. The challenge and the landscape continues to evolve. And so thinking about, how do we respond to the changing nature of the challenge and the landscape, and how do we continue to add value as things continue to change? So maybe just to wrap up here, I don't know if this is helpful, but it's something that I was actually thinking about over the past week as a way to understand the work that we're doing and how to sort of think about all of those pieces in the larger context of this system, this crisis that's going on. And I was doodling in my Illustrator, creating this diagram that we were working on. You don't have to understand the diagram, but basically it's sort of thinking about this as sort of, right, this is a system. What is a system around overdose? We have a large, right, it's being treated as a criminal. We have a huge criminalized approach to this, huge medicalization, a growing addiction population, growing illicit market. And so there's all these different factors at play, and we can, add more and more petals to this diagram. But I think part of this work is, we talk about taking on a portfolio approach. We know that there's no silver bullet solutions to something like this. And so thinking, quite intentionally about where are the different areas or places that we can apply pressure to reshape the system or to reshape things or move it in a different direction. And what role does that require us? Does that require from us to do so? And it's, it's not only the work that we're doing, it's the work that others are doing in the space. And it's also, thinking about life events. Life is changing all around us. COVID completely changed the landscape of this crisis. New legislation legalizing safe injection sites might also completely change the landscape. And so it's going to continue to change, and thinking about where are the different areas that we can intervene and apply different kinds of pressure. So I think the work ahead of us right now is sort of begs the question of, what are we working towards? What is the end goal here? And that's the work I think we're doing now with our collaborators, is trying to figure that out, trying to work towards sort of a shared end goal. And we think it has something to do with this, which is replacing the harmful system of care that we have and shifting towards something that is actually quite healing and compassionate and transformative. So that's all I got for you for now.
That is awesome. Thank you so much. I've just got like pages and pages of notes that I was scribbling down, and I know most of it, and yet I'm still like, oh wow, I forgot about this, and oh wow, no, I didn't even know about that, and there was like details all across there. Just before we thank you so much, Toby. Just before we open it up, and guys, feel free to post or be brave and ask questions and put your hand
Please.
up.
Conversation.
I just wanted to sort of bring in Clive on this as well, because just for some of your thoughts on that, and maybe to throw a few really challenging questions to Tobin as well.
Boy.
My main thought was, it looks like service design to me. It's just, I just loved it. And I loved the practicality and the amazing, just pragmatic words of advice you gave us. And this is exactly why we have practitioner talks, because you're showing what we do, and you're showing the impact it can have, and you can show the learning, the changing, the pivoting. These words are words we love. And it was really inspirational. Thank you so much for doing it. I'd rather the students popped in, and as you can hear, my voice is going. So over to you guys. But thank you so much. I really enjoyed that.
Thank you.
And brilliant, thanks, Clive. And for those I can see in the studio as well, and I can see some of the students online that are working on social impact challenge lab projects. You know, those markers that Tobin was talking about in terms of actually hosting, exploring space, and in service of what, you know, they're for some of you, they are spaces that you are exploring right now. You are exploring what it means to be a host, and to hold those spaces and to facilitate those spaces, what it means to probe, what it means to explore, on some of those things, and what it means to be in service of, you know, to what end. There's a thought that occurs to me, Tobin, in terms of, did you get a sense of some of the skills that are required as you transition from being more of a host, or as you transition, sorry, from being more of a sort of explorer to being a host, to then collaborating in service of something? Are there different things that are required of you, and is it possible for that to be in a person, or is that something that's found in a team?
Oh man, what a great question. I mean, I don't know. I think it changed along the whole way, right? Like it's sort of a constant learning process, and kind of just responding to what we're constantly learning. And so, I mean, I think some of it, to be honest, was right that initial sort of self-created project, the mainstay one. I think over time there was this realization, this learning that we had that a lot of the time we are not in the position to make those changes. We're sort of, I don't want to say design a savior, but to go into these spaces and environments and think that we can solve these things, that we're the right people to do that, especially in a space like this where oftentimes that isn't the case. And so it sort of took a while for me to learn, you know, how do we add value in this space? And we aren't the people necessarily making those changes and those decisions and you know, designing things differently. And so, but we know that it's hard for that work to happen. And so how do we create the conditions for that to happen? And maybe, you know, again, because of the urgency of this challenge, people are, you know, it's life and death. People are so busy saving lives and working, you know, not just their 9-to-5 jobs, but all of these people, you know, time is such a scarce resource in this space, and people are doing their jobs and volunteering and on committees and task force and this and that. And so to sort of find ways to carve out time to be able to come together and think about, you know, to pick our heads up a little bit long enough to think about how we move in different directions, or and try and do things differently and not just continue to do things the same way. So it's been sort of a constant learning. And I think, you know, when I was thinking about all those roles, that is the question actually that I'm still asking myself. What is the process for ourselves of learning, how do I be a better host in that role, or as facilitator, as a condition setter? What are the kinds of things that I need to learn to be better in that role? Because we don't just have those skills ready to go. And that's a learning process. I mean, even the design studios that we ran last summer, it was hard. It was hard to figure out, how do we create a space for productive debate? Not everyone's agreeing with each other. People are fighting and not agreeing. And so that's a hard conversation to facilitate, and a hard space to sort of keep open and have it sort of be safe enough for people to explore their ideas and their thoughts and opinions. So I don't think I have the skill sets for some of these roles, but I think that's okay. And I think trying to continue to learn how to find, learn the skill sets to be able to take on these roles better over time.
Well, and I mean, it's interesting because you use the word time, I think 3 or 4 times in that last in the last answer. And what was interesting about that is that had you been given a more restrictive, let's say, design brief within a period of time in order to be able to solve this, would it have been anywhere near? Would you have got anywhere near to where you are now with having a much more longer form approach to it? Do you feel like that would have completely hampered what you would have done if it would have been super limited in that?
Yeah, because I mean, again, the landscape of this is changing, and it's changing quite quickly. But I mean, I've also had to have a really sort of life check with myself in terms of my understanding of time and my expectations of time. I can be a quite impatient person, and I want things to change quickly. But some of it is slow work, and so it requires us, I think, if we can, to be in these spaces and in these areas long enough for a long enough period of time to do some of this work. It's not going to happen overnight. It takes a long time to build trust. It takes a long time to build relationships and tight relationships and trusting relationships. And so I think, especially, in the context of this work, it requires that time commitment, not only to being able to understand things more, but those sort of really human elements. If we really are serious about creating changes or improving our situation, improving lives of ourselves and of people, and creating a better world, that requires dedicating enough time to do that. It's not going to happen overnight. It's not going to happen in a year. It's not going to happen in 3 years. And so, yeah, I think it's kind of friction sometimes, I think, with certain design industries where, consultancy, for example, sort of in and out at a much quicker pace. And maybe some of that work requires that, but this work of systems change and human factors and deep rooted narratives, and that is very, very slow and long work. So it requires us to be in it for a long time, I think.
And I mean, also because of the latency between where understanding and research and evidence finally makes its way back into practice in the medical profession in the States actually takes quite some time anyway, right? But it was interesting as you were going through the presentation. I wonder if so designers that are operating in some kind of system thinking or social impact or service have more traditional ways of making sense of a landscape, right? Or capturing down the information using tools, stakeholder maps, journeys, and that kind of thing. I wonder if, but there was an approach of creating a paper, right? Because that was the language of the landscape that you were in. There was language of the people you were communicating with, collaborating with, I should say. Did you feel like that putting a paper together as a way of making sense of that landscape actually made it more helpful, or did you feel like it was more difficult to be able to articulate what your understanding of the landscape was?
Yeah, I mean, I have a weird love-hate relationship with the report. I mean, thinking about these outcomes, or what is the medium to be able that we can use to be able to communicate not just ideas, but exchange knowledge, or that can inform, that leads to changes or create impact. Right? It's not just about the ideas and the solutions themselves, but how do we package those things, and that So I think white papers do serve a purpose, right? There is I think part of it is it's seen as credibility. It's seen as it legitimizes the work that people have done. especially in the science world, publishing your work in peer-reviewed journals is important because that's what's legible. But in addition to that, I think that's maybe some of where design can come in, is what are the other mechanisms for not just disseminating, but creating those connections of how knowledge can continue and be passed on and transferred and picked up, so that we're not constantly doing new things all the time. I think that's actually the area that's really interesting right now, is there is such a disconnect between the transfer of knowledge and evidence and data. And I mean, to the point where in science, they literally have something called, translational research, which is a whole research area dedicated to the translation of evidence into practice, and why that takes so long. And they're trying to figure out what are the mechanisms to take research and evidence into practice. That's a huge gap that exists in science. And I think it does in design too. And so figuring out ways to tighten that connection. So I think Medium has some role to play in that.
Yes, spot on. It's certainly, like, not that we can compare those kind of different industries and sectors, but certainly looking at the criminal justice system, we have lots and lots of big literature reviews, but then the recommendations, are better staff training required, or better interventions need to be, and so there'll be some really, really good points. But then actually the dotted line of like, so what are we going to do, after this paper? It's still leaving it as super open-ended. And so there's lots and lots of thoughts that have been like captured, and some really great bits of research, possibly even an insight, but it still leaves it hanging, right? There's the delta there.
Mm-hmm. Huge delta, yeah.
I have a question from the team. What was your favorite design tool during this process? Which kind of touches a little bit on, because we were talking about capturing and making sense of stuff through the paper, but was there a particular either tool that you've used before and traditional, or something that you've created that you felt was the most helpful across? I know actually the question was your favorite design, but I'm going to double it up with your favorite and the most helpful.
I'm trying to understand design tool, that word.
Well,
because
you know what that word is, but I mean, like, in terms of, like, I guess how it's been, I would imagine, unless Alex wants to jump in on that, I would imagine some kind of, this is a stakeholder map, this is a user journey.
Yeah.
So maybe that these things give us more of a scope of something that's going on than talking about it or a written paragraph might give. It's arguable that they don't actually sometimes, that they become more complex, they make things more complicated than they need to be. But I would imagine that's where Alex is going. But if I'm wrong, please correct me, Alex.
Well, I mean, I think that's what I was trying to, yeah. I mean, I think for me, it was simple things like, I found actually that it added a lot of value when we're working, especially with our science and health research partners, to just the fact of drawing, like being able to draw and visualize things in those conversations is really helpful. I showed sort of the axonometric drawing of questions of where harm reduction centers should be. Should they be in hospitals or should they be mobile? And even just, visual tools to be able to have a conversation around, right? It sort of grounds the conversation, because everyone has their own ideas about what the future is going to look like or what we're discussing. And everyone has their own sort of reality of it. But unless we're creating visual tools for ourselves to all of us look at the same thing and then have a conversation about what we're looking at, it's a way of sort of creating that shared language and that sort of shared perspective. So, I mean, for me, I think some of the most helpful and like interesting conversations that I've had during this with people is sort of focused around those visual tools and objects and artifacts that we bring into those conversations and the way that people interact with them.
That's brilliant. Thank you. I was thinking about towards the end of the presentation where you were saying that actually in service of kind of ultimately like healing, or not in service of healing. But that was the last slide around like the service to bring a kind of healing to it. And that in itself felt like quite an interesting word, because it's not necessarily the surface level. I mean, I took it as not necessarily meaning the surface level condition of a physical healing, of like, actually, I want this addiction, you know, to be resolved and to have to be dependent on opioids per se, but healing in a much more profound sense of, I'm currently ostracized from society and community, and there is maybe some kind of pathway of me being not a second-class citizen or on the fringes, but actually being accepted. And I think there's a kind of a possibly more profound narrative around what healing could look like then, which opens up the door to say, you know, isn't all design possibly that's focusing on, like, you know, claiming back agency, and certainly from those that are on the fringe of society has that kind of sense of healing to it. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And I mean, I think in addition, I mean, when we talk about it being such a harmful system right now, it's not just, it's definitely harmful for people who use drugs and substances, but it's also really harmful for everyone involved. It's for care workers. There's a lot of harm being perpetuated, whether it's secondhand trauma, or the way that sort of they're involved in this space is very intense and very, very harmful. So, you know, when we talk about healing, it's for everyone involved. It's for law enforcement, it's for care workers, it's for people who use drugs, it's for family members, it's on and on and on. I think everyone sort of in this space is, there's a lot of perpetuating harm. So thinking about healing, not just, I mean, at a very complex level, but also for a lot of people, a lot of different people. What does that look like?
Amazing. I'm conscious of time, and I don't want to go beyond the hour of everybody's space and allocation. But will you come back again and share more, and possibly even help us understand a bit more around approaches to healthcare and some of those elements?
I would love to. I'd love to continue, and it would be great to be there in person. I'm so sad that we couldn't do this in person. So I would love to be able to hang out in studio with you all.
Well, you're only down the road, kind of.
I'm just a hop plane over.
Or a train. You know, we don't need to be.
True.
Yeah. Okay. Okay, brilliant. Well, look, let's explore that, because I think that would be amazing. Thank you so much, guys. Thank you for tuning in. And guys in the studio, little waves there. That's great. And until next time, thank you so much, Tobin.
Thank you.